Hello and welcome to today's webinar about emotional literacy. Thank you all very much for joining us on a Friday morning. Before we get going, I just want to introduce you to the speakers today. So my name's Ruth Moody and I'm the Managing Director here at Farscape Development. For me, the topic of emotions has been a really interesting journey over the last 11 years since we've been running the organisation, and particularly seeing how emotions impact on how leaders build relationships, communicate, how effective they are in terms of building relationships at work. So it's a topic that's close to our heart. I'm joined today by Neil Kimberley, who's our commercial director here at Farscape, and again he's done a lot of research into the world of emotions, and particularly looking at the relevance of emotions in the context of leadership. It's obviously been a really popular topic because it's great to see so many people joining us from previous webinars, but also new people joining us. So it's obviously something that's been really relevant for people at the moment in the workplace. We're going to be building today upon some of the previous topics that we've looked at in some of the webinars that you may have joined us in the past. So hopefully you'll start to sort of see some continuity, you'll start to kind of be able to layer up some of the information that we've shared with you before. Before I carry on, I just wanted to apologise in advance. We've been struck down a little bit by the lurgy here at Farscape, and I'm suffering from a cough which suddenly catches me unawares every now and then. So if I do suddenly have a coughing fit, Neil will take over, and I will rejoin when I stop coughing. So I apologise for that if that does happen. So in terms of today then, what are some of the things that we're going to be looking at? Well, we had a lot of questions that came in from those of you who submitted them prior to the webinar about why emotional literacy in particular is really interesting to you in a business context, and looking at, you know, how relevant is it for leaders, for salespeople, for high potentials. So for us today, I think what we first of all need to explore is what is emotional literacy and why is it relevant in business, and it is so relevant in all sorts of different areas. And necessarily we have to therefore start with looking at, well, defining emotions as a sort of first point, and looking at some of the basic theories of emotions and how they can help or hinder our understanding. We're then going to look at how emotions link to physiology and behaviours and different ways of understanding emotional literacy. And then, critically, the impact that developing a greater emotional literacy has in a work context. So how can this work to our positive advantage at work? How can we make sure that our leaders, our high potentials, understand and have greater emotional literacy so that they have a more positive impact at work? So for us, emotions really kind of underpins a lot of the work that we do, and particularly our philosophy, which I've just flashed up on the screen here, which I want to touch upon very briefly. There are sort of three key areas for us, and some of you may have heard us speak about this before, but the first area is consciousness. So how do we raise people's consciousness of what's going on inside them, both in terms of personality, their values, but also critically emotions. And what we found over the years of delivering programs which ask people to raise their consciousness is that it can be quite difficult to get into emotional intelligence in a practical way, but actually people find emotional literacy a much more accessible topic and much more engaging, and it's something that we can more practically do things with in order to help people really understand and explore what it is. So that kind of one area of consciousness is crucial. Then moving on from that is place. So what's the physical space or place that we're operating in, but also the psychological space. And I think if we're going to ask people to start to explore emotions, the place that you're in and the space that you're in is really important. And you may want to kind of go back and look at some of the work that we've done around place to think about that alongside the emotional literacy side of things that we're talking about today. And then equally, reflective experience. That really crucial, stopping, pausing, asking people to think and reflect. I think that's a really important part of helping people to explore emotional literacy. So it really, for us, does underpin everything that we do. And hopefully today we'll be able to give you some insight into what it is, but also how you can then use it in your organisations to help leaders in particular develop and have a greater positive impact. So before I hand over to Neil, this next quote is one of our inspirations for this webinar, and as I'm sure all of you will know, inspiration often comes from some really unexpected places, so I hope you enjoy this quote here. Neil, over to you.
Thanks, Ruth. Morning, everyone. So yeah, as Ruth said in what we're going to try and cover in some of the learning points today, we felt we needed to start with emotion itself. And it's a very broad, for any of you who have looked into that in some detail, it's a very broad area. So Ruth, if I can just get you to click onto the next slide. I mean, what we're looking at here are just two of the key theories that are out there and have been out there for a long time around what emotions are and how we understand them. So the constructivist theory, and there's lots of writing about this, typically, rather than breaking emotions down into distinct groups or basic types, basically just looks at the idea that there are two specific dimensions to emotion, and which are both there on that bottom box there. So one being around arousal, so how much energy is going in, so getting people to recognise and notice how much energy is going into that emotion. So it's about sort of degree of feeling it. And then the second one is valence. Then is it a positive emotion or is it a negative one? So that's one theory. It doesn't necessarily disagree with the emotions that are in the basic emotion theory, but they're very two different schools in the way that they look at it. So I think one of the things for us is when we sort of work on this with delegates is making people aware that actually emotions is still quite a grey area, although it's been studied for some time. There isn't a huge amount of consensus, and as we move on in a minute, we'll see that that's moved on in the last couple of years as well. So the basic emotion theory, and again, some of you have probably come across this before. So probably the last 40 years, this theory has been around. A lot of the work by Paul Ekman, basically trying to look at can you psychologically reduce emotions down to these basic emotions, and the ones that make up his theory are those there that are on the screen: the fear, anger, disgust, sadness, surprise, and joy. Again, at this basic emotion theory, there's a large degree of consensus, but there are still other theories out there. Some will sort of 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different emotions. So it's a large area. But Paul Ekman's work seems to have been the one that most people have anchored themselves to. Interesting. Then, if we move on, Ruth, one of the more recent advancements in this area around these basic tools is the work by Hugo Lofheim. So this was his model. It was created back in 2012. He used an eight basic emotions, which was the underlying theory that was from a guy called Sylvan Tompkins. But what he tried to then do is take those 8 basic emotions that you can see in the corners of the cube, and then map onto that using a 3D diagram with three axes, where the axes are then the 3 sort of key neurochemicals that are at play in the brain, which hopefully, by studying the levels of each of those chemicals in the brain at a scientific level, you could start to relate that to specific basic emotions. So the only reason we put this up there, I mean, his theory hasn't been tested yet, and hasn't been verified, but if this does develop into a useful theory, then it'd be a good way of scientifically being able to identify whether these basic emotions do exist. I think for us as well, the use of these neurochemicals in it is also an interesting way of explaining emotions to delegates, because we can tie it in then to a lot more of the neuroscience that they might have already heard of. So Ruth, I think you're going to say a little bit more about that and the neurochemicals in the brain.
Thanks, Neil. Yeah. So I think what we find is that people are really fascinated by the whole sort of topic of neuroscience and actually understanding what's going on inside them, particularly at a chemical level. And so these 3 key chemicals that you saw on the previous diagram, the first one, noradrenaline, this one is very much, in its most basic terms, the one that triggers the brain and the body for action. So it's often associated with the fight or flight response. It kind of increases arousal, alertness, promotes vigilance, and really focuses attention. So people tend to kind of notice when this has been triggered by an increase in heart rate, blood pressure. There are other things that happen, such as triggering the release of glucose from energy stores and so on. So it's very much, as I say, that fight or flight response, and it's the start of the process that brings in other chemicals that you may have heard of, such as cortisol, which are those chemicals which are then, they shut down parts of the brain so that they can just focus on the response to that perceived threat. And that will have a direct impact. So the actual emotions happening in the body will then have a direct impact on people's behaviour. We move then up to the top left, the dopamine. This is the chemical that's then associated with reward, motivation, achievement striving, working harder, working faster, ambition, and so on and so forth. And so it can be very much seen as a positive chemical. So when people want to achieve and strive, great. But it can also sometimes, when people get stuck into what's called a threat drive loop, where they're moving from that threat brain to the drive brain, actually the dopamine in itself is addictive, and actually people kind of get stuck in a loop between those two things, where the dopamine, that kind of excitement, that achievement seeking is driving that behavior, and quite often sometimes we see people burning out, really starting to see the negative effects of that loop. And then down in the bottom left-hand corner is the serotonin, which is much more associated with happiness, wellness, contentment, connection. And this is an area of the brain which is soothing, and the human need for connection, actually being able to move into what other people may have heard of as safe brain, is a really important part of how the brain operates, and the different ways that we experience emotions, what that does to our behaviours. So Neil, I think you're then going to go on to talk about some recent research.
Yeah, so just moving on from this idea of those two basic theories of emotion, and just bringing it up to date really, where some of the thinking has moved on that. And one of the most recent studies that's been done on how many basic emotions there are was by a group at the Institute of Neuroscience and Psychology at University of Glasgow. And what they did was move it away from researching it from a psychological perspective and try to take a more scientific approach, but rather than the neurochemical approach, looking at the field of facial recognition. And they did a whole series of studies looking at the muscles. There's 80 or so different muscles that are used in the face to express the different emotions. And what they actually found, at a pure biological level, the emotions of fear and surprise were very, very similar in terms of how they're expressed. And similarly, anger and disgust. So the findings of their study were saying that, at a pure biological level, you could argue that there are only 4 basic emotions, yet did agree that at more of a social level, these 6 basic emotions were distinct in the way that people recognized them. So it's just interesting to see that it is this whole area of emotions, even before we get on to talking about how you describe it as an individual and experience it. At a scientific level, a psychological level, there still isn't a huge consensus between those models as to what are the sort of psychologically irreducible states that emotion gets to. So it's just to sort of bring you up to date that research is still moving on apace as we speak. The other thing we then wanted to move on to is this idea that when we sort of work with clients on this and delegates, is that if we've got those basic emotions, whether we agree that it's 4, 6, 7, or 8, it's getting people to understand that there are then many more than that. And a lot of the basic emotion theory then moves on to talk about this idea between primary and secondary emotions, and almost the idea that the basic emotions, if you treat it like primary colours, that you can then mix those primary colours together and those primary emotions, and they then create the secondary emotions. So it's getting people to just start to notice that, okay, we've got these underlying baseline emotions, but then how do we start to recognize what the combinations of those are, and how useful that can be to sort of being more articulate in the way we identify emotions in ourselves and in other people. So it's just something that, just a few examples there. Obviously there are many, many more secondary emotions that we could list out, and obviously the primary ones that are randomly seem to have picked all the negative ones. So we've got joy would be missing out there as a primary emotion. But moving on from that, then the other thing that we then start to look at with delegates, and if you can move on, Ruth, is this idea that, so what are emotions? So there's that basic theory we just talked about, but there's this whole field of words and terms that people talk about around emotion, and are they the same or are they different? So these 5 sort of states here that we've listed of mood, motivations, personality, temperament, and disposition are words that are often used interchangeably with emotion, and they're often all intertwined. So it's useful to explore this with delegates. So noticing that mood is more about, it's often less intense than an emotion, tends to be, it's less likely to be triggered by a particular stimulus. and tend to fall into that camp of either positive or negative. So people will usually be speaking of being in, a good mood or a bad mood. So it's getting people to realise that it's linked to emotion, but is different. And then similarly with motivations, in a way it's a theoretical sort of construct that's used to explain behaviour. So the motivations sort of represent the reasons for people's actions, their desires, their needs. And it's, we help sort of people look at what are the definitions of that, and how people develop an inclination for a specific behaviour out of that, and how different that can be to emotion. Obviously, personality, don't need to say too much about that. I'm sure that you've all got tools that you use in your organisations, whether they're personality type tools like Insights and MBTI, or more in-depth personality traits tools like the NEO, for example, that we often use with more senior leaders. But just explaining that there are elements of personality traits and how they might be linked in to emotions. We'll come on to talk about that in a bit more detail in a subsequent slide. Temperament, obviously, then this often comes from the field of education, and the field of education, especially in schools, has looked at emotional literacy for quite some time. It's interesting that we haven't picked up on it so much in the corporate world. But what they're often testing there are common factors that you can identify in people that are easily measurable. So the sense of irritability, activity. Often one thing around frequency of smiling, how smiley and happy people are, or whether people have an approach or try and avoid particular unfamiliar events. And then finally, disposition. This is just getting people to understand. So what actually does that mean? This is around, in a way, a disposition is it's an artificial habit. It's a preparation or getting into a state of readiness. Or a tendency to act in a specific way that can be learned. So it's not necessarily a process or event, but it's a structure that's in waiting for someone to use when they're presented with a particular event or environment. So we just get people to sort of think around these, that they are intertwined with emotion, yet they are different. And there's a couple more that Ruth's going to explain in a bit more detail now.
Thanks, Neil. Something I forgot to mention at the beginning, actually, is if anyone has any questions, please do submit a question over on your webinar software. I'll be keeping an eye on the questions as we go through, and if I know that we're going to cover that answer, I won't ask the question, but actually if there's anything that then comes up which is outside what we were planning to cover, I'll make sure that we cover that in the questions at the end. So please do submit questions. One thing actually that's just come in before I move on is a question about the NEO, just asking what the NEO is. Neil, do you want to just very quickly explain what that is?
Yeah, so the NEO is a personality trait psychometric. We use it here at Farscape, as I mentioned, especially at senior level. I think for us, so the difference with a trait psychometric, personality psychometric, is it uses, so the NEO specifically uses 5 domains of personality. So it looks at neuroticism, extroversion, openness, agreeableness, and conscientiousness. And then within that whole field of those big 5 personality domains has had a lot of empirical research done it over the last sort of 20 years or so. And the NEO is often used as the gold standard. It is often used as a reference point in lots of research around personality. So for us, it's one that we feel is, as I said, the gold standard. It's got a lot of data behind it, and also the detail that it goes into. So for each of those 5 domains, there are then 6 further personality facets that it breaks it down into. And then rather with a type where you're either one or the other, for the person receiving the report and the feedback, for each of those 30 personality facets, it then measures them on a scale from whether they display that personality trait in a very low way or in a very extreme way, and so they can be anywhere on a spectrum. So I think for us, it just gives people a much greater depth insight into their personality. And then, as we mentioned before, because that then is linked to emotions, it's a good way of tapping in and taking people into that sort of deeper look at what their own emotions are. So that's why for us it's one that we like to use.
Great, thanks, Neil. So in terms of the work that we do, we quite often get sort of asked, why emotions? Why is that so important to be able to be more articulate about emotions? And actually one of the key areas that we then speak about is the really important link that emotions has to each of these areas on the screen in front of you, to our behaviours, to our cognition, the way we think, and to our feelings. And just to very briefly touch upon those links and how we see them. If we start with how emotions impact on behaviours, there is a link between emotion and behaviour. So one good example would be if people have an extroversion trait, are these people more likely to wear their heart on their sleeves than those people who are perhaps have a more introverted trait, where they may be more private, might not share their emotions as much? And so people's emotions will drive their behaviours to a certain extent, and it's useful to understand that link and notice when that might be at play. Moving around then to the left around cognition, different people, different theories have different views on this. So some theories claim that emotion is separate to cognition and it can precede the thinking, if you like. For other people, the other theories kind of look at actually they are integrated. So for example, the realization of danger and then that subsequent arousal of the nervous system, so things like rapid heartbeat, breathing, sweating, muscle tension, all of those kind of things, is an integral part of the experience of fear, so they can't be separated. The emotion and the thinking can't be separated. And then if we look around then to the feelings side of things, some of you may be familiar with Alan Watkins' coherence model, and I'm just going to talk briefly about that now. Let me just move the slides on. They seem to be stuck. There we go. So what we find is, in terms of Alan Watkins' coherence model, he looks at the fact that the physiology, the raw biological data signals in our body, those are the notes. So it's a nice analogy. Those are the notes that are playing. So heart rate, breathing, temperature. Then the emotion is actually how those notes combine together to create the tune. And then finally the feeling is actually an awareness in our minds that that tune is being played. So really the feelings are the observation of the emotion. So I think that's a really important point in terms of how emotions link to feelings, and why we need to be really aware of what's going on and help leaders, help people in organisations to understand how their emotions are impacted on each of those three areas of behaviours, cognition and feelings. Neil, one of the questions that came up a lot in the pre-webinar registration was around the difference between emotional intelligence and emotional literacy, so I think you're going to speak a little bit about this now.
Yeah, and I think it's a valid question, and I suppose one of the things for us is this suddenly become the new black, emotional literacy as opposed to emotional intelligence. And I think for us it isn't really that. I think we've been looking at the whole side of emotional literacy for a while, and as I mentioned earlier, the field of education has been studying and teaching this in schools, especially at sort of primary level, for a long time. And so we're just going to do a little bit just to sort of look at some of the emotional intelligence models, just to remind ourselves of what we mean by that, and then move on to look at how emotional literacy is different and is a specific element of it. So what we've got on the screen here is Daniel Goleman's model, and obviously this has been around some time now, and you've got all the elements on the screen there. What obviously is behind this and has sort of developed since and separated out, there are two other sort of models of emotional intelligence that are worth looking at if you're going to look at it in any detail. So there's obviously a trait model, so that has been around since the early 2000s and was sort of pioneered by a guy called Petrides. And what he was specifically looking at there was actually, was it an intelligence or was it more of a trait like personality? So it was often explored, so his model where people approach emotional intelligence in that way, it's often explored at the same time as personality frameworks. And it probably looks at those emotional traits more around sort of self-efficacy of the emotions. And then sort of alongside that, which then made is the other half of the mixed model of Goleman's, is then the ability model. So the two sort of leading experts in that field and that model of ability on intelligence, emotional intelligence, was Mayer and Salovey, which has been around since probably a bit later than the trait model, around sort of 2004 that sort of started. But they sort of identify 4 specific abilities that come under emotions and emotional intelligence. And interestingly, of the 4 that they've got, the first one, which is about perceiving it, so they've got perceiving emotions, using emotions, understanding them, and managing them. But the key bit for them under perceiving emotions, and this is where we lead into emotional literacy, is that the perceiving emotion, the ability of perceiving emotions, is all around how we can represent the basic aspects of emotional intelligence, and it makes all the other processing of emotional information possible. And what they talk about is that if you're not able to have the capacity to express your feelings and be able to label your emotions, then the other three abilities just simply can't happen. So a key part of their 4 ability model is that you can't really move past the first stage of that model if you haven't mastered noticing, perceiving, being able to label and discuss them. So that's why for us the emotional literacy side of it is such a key part, because it's a particular skill and a particular element that if you can't master it and be able to discuss it, the other sort of trait models and mixed models, really you're not going to move on with them other than learn a bit of new knowledge. Are you actually going to be able to engage with it? So if we just move on from the slide we've got now, Ruth's already mentioned Alan Watkins' coherence model, and I think this very badly drawn iceberg that I've done here on the screen is supposed to represent this idea that a lot of the courses that as practitioners we'll focus on is around delivering results, changing behaviours. But if you've studied any of his work and his book Coherence, is that we really need to look at the stuff that's below the waterline. So this idea that the physiology that Ruth mentioned before, that the raw data that's coming, that we're experiencing all the time, if we notice it, that's what's driving emotions. If we're able to notice those emotions consciously, that then creates the feelings, and we know through that the neurochemical work we mentioned earlier on that those feelings then will have an impact on the thinking that we're having and the way we process, at a cognitive level, which then drives the behaviours. So for us, the whole idea of emotional literacy is that if you're going to notice those emotions and feelings, you've then got to be able to articulate that to somebody else. So if we want to get people to engage at an emotional level on programs, in our experience, it seems to be much easier to get people at all levels in organisations to engage in the language of emotions rather than these abstract models of intelligence. Then you can lead into those if you want to take it further. But it just seems that emotional language, i.e. literacy, seems to be an easier way for people to tap into this as a topic. So Ruth, you think you're going to say a bit more about moving on to emotional literacy and what we think that is?
Yeah, thanks, Neil. And I think emotional literacy, we've said these words quite a lot so far in this webinar, and actually I think now we've given some background to some of the thinking and research around emotions. It's really important to define, well, what do we actually mean by emotional literacy? And I think essentially, Neil touched upon it a moment ago, it's around the language of emotion and particularly the ability to express feelings. The first definition on here I think is a really good one. It's very specific. It's saying that it's the ability to express feelings with specific words in 3-word sentences. I feel hurt being a good example. So we're going to come on to sort of talk a little bit more about that ability to express feelings and so on. It's also then about understanding emotions and listening to others and empathizing with their emotions. So that ability to express emotions productively. So I think that's a really important part of being emotionally literate and handling emotions in a way that improves, as it says in this second quote here, improves your personal power. And then finally, Neil's touched upon it already, but that capacity to perceive and express feelings and the ability to label emotions, it's very much that first step on the route to developing emotional intelligence. So a really important part of what we mean by emotional literacy. So you've been listening to us for a while now, and we'd just like to ask you a question to consider if you've got a pen and paper in front of you. Since you woke up this morning, can you list the emotions that you've experienced since then? We're going to do a poll in a second around the answers that you give. So just spend a couple of minutes thinking, since I woke up this morning, what are the emotions that I've experienced? So I'm going to pop a poll up on the screen now. It'd be really interesting to understand then from you, how many emotions did you manage to count? So if I launch this poll now, hopefully that should be appearing on the screen in front of you. And I can see that people are starting to vote on that, which is great. Brilliant. I'm just going to give it a while longer. We're up to about 70% of you have voted on this. Couple more seconds.
A huge amount of time to come up with a list.
Yeah, so that might skew the results. Okay, so I'm going to close the poll now and share with you the results that have come in so far. So you should be able to see on your screen that actually, if I can get it onto my screen, which I can't, I think looking at it, we've got the majority of you are in the 1 to 5 box with over 50%, and then very few people up towards that higher end of the scale. And actually, that's not unusual. We tend to find that actually, when asking people to list the emotions they've experienced, it tends to be quite a small number. And we're going to go on to talk about in a moment some of the information that we learn about the expression of feelings and emotions, and how limited actually often we find people's ability to express them is. So if I hide the results, and hopefully you should now all have the PowerPoint back on your screen in front of you. So moving on from there then, what's emotional literacy for? So we've talked about the background to emotions, we've talked about the definition of emotional literacy, and as we've been going through, we've touched upon some of the ways in which it's important in business. But I think it's really important just to spend a moment thinking about, okay, so what is this for? Clearly it is about being able to identify feelings precisely, and we're going to come on to talk a little bit more about what that means and some practical tools around what is a feeling that has been described or identified precisely and what isn't. But critically then, if we can identify our feelings precisely, we're then able to communicate these feelings and therefore our needs, and I think that's a really crucial part to this, is being able to express our needs to other people. All of the research shows us that we are socially interdependent creatures, and actually with a need to support each other emotionally, because we've evolved with a need to communicate feelings and to understand the emotional needs of others. So actually, this starting point, this ability to identify feelings precisely and accurately is really important. Humans can read emotion in non-verbal communication, and just referring back to that slide that Neil talked about in terms of facial recognition, we are able to read emotion in a non-verbal way, but actually words are much clearer. They allow us greater specificity. It makes sure that we don't confuse one feeling with another. But actually we've got a really poor record in the teaching of how to speak using feeling words. And just to refer back to that poll then, most of us scored 1 to 5 emotions since waking up this morning, but actually there are over 4,000 words that can help us describe and identify our emotions. So there's so many words out there that we just don't use, and that's all around the kind of topic of helping people to develop their emotional literacy.
And Ruth, can I just
yeah, go on. Yeah.
Can I just add a point on those last two, because I mentioned about the educational research, and I think that last but one point is, if we think about it, probably in the last sort of 10 to 15 years, there's been a lot done in education, sort of preparing young people to be able to engage with their emotions, to share them, to articulate them. The poor record is obviously for the people of our era, and if you think about a lot of the sort of mid to senior leaders we've got in organisations now, this wouldn't have been a topic that would have been covered in school. And so depending on whether they were part of an environment at home that would have spoken this way, there's a lot of leaders where, as Ruth said, it's not really unsurprising that people are only able to come up with a small number. I mean, in our experience, we very rarely get senior leaders who can come up with more than 10 emotions that they've experienced in the last week, let alone since waking up this morning. I think so. Part of it for us is showing people, look, you are having all of these emotions, and you need to start being able to notice more of them, be able to articulate them, and so make sure that you're getting what you need, or identify, especially for those of you managers, what your people need in your teams.
Thanks, Neil. And I think what we notice as well is that we tend to focus, or people tend to focus, on labelling people's situations instead of our own emotional response to it. So a good example of that in terms of labelling a situation would be, she is a nightmare, this is a disaster, or it's an accident waiting to happen. So those actually aren't an expression of our own feelings. We're labelling something instead. And we're going to talk a little more in a moment about some of the ways that really clear, good, emotionally literate communication can get corrupted by some of these things that we tend to do, which are around labelling and masking and so on. But Neil, I think for now you are going to go on to talk about a little bit more about feeling words.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the points on that last slide was around this. There's a really useful resource on the internet called EQI.org, and they've been collecting through their network, collecting these words that describe feelings and emotions for a long time, and you can go online and you can download their lists of words. So I've just picked out a handful here. But one of the things we start to do with delegates is to start to explore, well, how do you break if there are 4,000 words out there, how do you start to break those down and how do you use them? So I mean, a really simple way is just looking at the difference between the positive and the negative. And the key thing is the bit that's just under the title there. So the positive emotional feeling words, then, when they've been recognised consciously and articulated, is that they're helping people to indicate that their emotional needs are being met. However, the negative ones, and this is the bit then for us recognising where it's really useful, not only recognising in ourselves, but especially in other people if we're managing and leading them, is if they're using language that is on this negative half, this is what this is actually saying, is that there are some unmet emotional needs that they have. So, you know, for example, if I'm afraid, what's that actually mean? So if we click onto the next one, Ruth, so a negative feeling word is actually describing an unmet emotional need. So for example, you know, if someone's saying I feel lonely, then potentially there's a strong chance there that there's an unmet emotional need of needing to belong to something, whether that's being more involved in a team or a project or whatever. Or I feel ignored. You know, again, there's potential there that there's some more deeper unmet emotional need of needing to be noticed or recognised. So we start to get people looking at, you know, what are those different. One, use more of those words. It helps to articulate more specifically what's being experienced, but also then to recognise what information can you get from those words. So I think specifically it's a really important skill for those people that are managing and leading teams, being able to recognise some of that, one, encouraging the language in others, but then being able to recognise, you know, what that's actually telling them when they hear it.
Thanks, Neil.
So Ruth, I think you're going to now move on to what's happening when people do it well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is one of the key parts of working with leaders or high potentials or whoever it is that you're working with, in terms of helping them to understand, well, what actually does really good, articulate, emotional communication look like? And so there are three key areas that we're focusing on today. So the first one is around I messages versus you messages. So that links back to that point around 3-word sentences. So I messages are 3-word sentences where we focus on our own emotions. We're not making assumptions or false perceptions about other people's emotions. So I feel motivated, I feel ignored, I feel incompetent. They would be examples of really good, articulate, emotional communication. So some examples of you messages, things like you make me feel angry, I feel like you disrespect me, I feel like you don't care. The latter two there, I feel like you disrespect me and I feel like you don't care, they're actually kind of you messages disguised as I messages. And sometimes people will kid themselves that they are using I messages by putting I feel at the front of the sentence and then turn it into a you message by saying, like you disrespect me. So it's really helping people to understand the difference between a pure, genuine I message, I feel motivated, I feel ignored, and a you message, even if it might be cleverly disguised as an I message. And actually, I think this is a really, really important area of emotional communication, just in life in general, whether that's at work or in personal relationships. And it's very difficult to sustain a positive relationship with somebody if they aren't willing to own those feelings and to use I sentences rather than you sentences. And I'm sure all of you have experienced situations where somebody is using the you messages, and actually in the end relationships are very difficult to sustain if somebody continually uses those kind of you messages, because they're not owning or taking responsibility for the feelings that they're having, and in many ways they're almost transferring the blame onto you. So I think that's a really important part of articulate emotional communication. The second one that was then around intensity. So really the ability to be able to describe the degree to which our needs are being or not being met. So it's a really important part of sending a clear message without distortion. So it can be done in one of three ways that you can see on the screen here. The first one is weighting. So I feel a little bit annoyed through to I feel extremely annoyed. We're giving someone a gauge of how intense that feeling is. Alternatively, you can use a spectrum of words. So I feel upset, I feel distraught, I feel bereft, starting at one end of the scale through to a more extreme end of the scale, and kind of gives a really clear sense of where am I at, how extreme is this feeling. And then finally using a scale, a numerical scale, and this is something that we often see used in schools, in particular with children. So asking them to grade on a numerical scale where they're at. So I feel hurt, 3 out of 10. And actually a lot of people around the whole EQI space prefer this number 3 here, this numerical scale in terms of describing intensity, because it's much more accurate. But each of those 3 works well and allows us to explain what the intensity of our emotions are. And then finally, explaining, not labeling. So labeling, then, we've talked a little bit about that, but it's when we're not actually expressing a feeling, we're giving it a label instead. So I feel like an idiot actually isn't a feeling, it's giving it a label. I'm now becoming something else. So it's about being really clear about what language we're using, keeping it clean, making sure that we are owning that feeling, we're expressing the intensity of it, and we are definitely describing a feeling, not labeling something else. And we're going to come on to talk a little bit more about labeling in a bit more detail in a second. And part of the whole work with leaders or with organisations that we do or that you can do as practitioners is helping them to understand what good, articulate emotional communication is and giving them opportunities to practice. This is not the kind of thing that can happen in a 2-hour workshop, unfortunately. It needs to be almost the spine of any leadership development work that's done to really help people to relearn the language of communication and emotional communication, because as Neil has rightly said, for a lot of people this is something that hasn't been introduced at school, and therefore it's a new habit to learn, it's a new thing that they need to be able to kind of develop and roll around in their mouth in a sense. Neil?
Yes, I mean the slide that you've got up here, which I'm sure you've all had a chance to read now, is starting to get away from, okay, so what is emotional literacy, to, well, why bother? You know, we've got a whole list of things we're trying to achieve in L&D in our organisations. You know, why would this be important? So I think for us, it's starting to think about that. You know, if you can get people to even begin to start to notice what emotions they're having, whether they're being triggered from things that are happening outside of the workplace, within the workplace, and being able to accurately name them and describe them to others, then only once they've gone through that process are they then able to get to the more useful second stage, which is the paragraph at the bottom there, which once they can explain, you know, why they feel it, what they feel, it then becomes more of a thinking process. It's you know, more of a logical, cognitive part of the brain that's engaged, and we're able to more easily then explain and understand what's going on. So where is this coming from? Is it driven by a particular person? Is it one of my beliefs or values that are being compromised? And helps people to really then explore the resultant behaviours that are then happening in the workplace. So that's the sort of key thing for us as to, well, why would you bother engaging with this as a topic? Because it's that simple bit at the beginning of noticing and being able to articulate it, that if you can't name those feelings, it's much, much harder for us to turn it into then a cognitive process in the brain, understand it, and then explore it and find out, well, what can I do with these behaviours to change them? So we can then move on. What we then talk about is, so what's the impact if you don't do it? So a lot of the negative behaviours and poor behaviours that often happen in organisations, and there's a lot. I'm sure a lot of you will have seen. There's a lot being written now about trying to create fear-free organisations so that people can stay in that safe brain mode where they can be more relaxed, less anxious, more creative, more innovative. And a lot of those negative behaviours come from poor and miscommunication. So why people won't engage in this more emotionally literate language is often that it might be that there's a culture within the organisation that it's not seen as socially acceptable, especially if those emotions are negative. If people are trying to notice it and discuss it with other people, it's that fear of causing offence for raising the topic in the first place. Or by sharing their own emotions, especially if there's a sense that they might have the perception of being negative, then there's that fear of receiving that social disapproval, whether that's the culture within a particular team, a particular department, or just the general culture within the organisation. So what happens then is the bit in bold at the bottom then, is that what happens is many organisations end up creating, unwittingly and probably unconsciously, not knowing it's there, is this environment where it's more important for people to appear okay than to actually describe the reality of their situation. So yeah, as long as I appear okay on the surface, that's what this organisation expects. So for us, the idea of why would you engage with emotional literacy is to say, actually, is that a healthy place for people to be in? How can people stay resilient if they're constantly having to put on this appearance at an emotional level that everything's okay? So that's why for us, this would be the reason to discuss it. So some of the things that can result in, miscommunication amongst teams, within teams, people's emotional needs are then not being understood or met by the managers and line managers of the people that they're responsible for. It then can generate this, almost like a vicious cycle of being misunderstood, because people are just putting on this brave face and appearing, thinking that they have to appear to be okay, and can lead to those fearful environments where people aren't willing to discuss what are the underlying emotions and feelings that they're experiencing that are driving the behaviours that they're being challenged on, which obviously then ultimately the end of the conclusion is that leads to anxiety, stress, and all the stuff we talked about before about raising stress levels. High levels of cortisol in the brain means people aren't thinking as clearly. They're not going to be producing as high quality work. Good thinking, it reduces that innovative and creative space that you want people to get into. And more importantly, it means that managers and leaders are avoiding those difficult conversations because they might be picking up on the body language of the emotions and feelings that they're seeing in someone else, but they're displaying an appearance because that's what they feel they need to do in a positive way. So it's for those reasons that we need to start looking at how poor emotional literacy has an impact on the organisation. So I've got some examples here of things that we get people then to start to look at as to, so if I was doing it well, what wouldn't I be doing? So the things where people often then corrupt this emotional language to try and promote an appearance of being okay is these things here. So the masking then, so this is where people will, I guess, plainly lie about how they're feeling. I'm sure you can all think of examples where you've asked a member of the team, how are you feeling? I'm fine. But clearly they're vexed, anxious, angry, and so, or where people often will substitute feelings. So, people might, you might get someone saying, I hope we hit that target, whereas what they actually mean is, I'm really worried and anxious that we're going to miss the target and what happens next. So that they're hiding the feeling behind a hope or an expectation. The inconsistency corruption there. So this is where voice, tone, pitch, emotion in the voice and body language don't match the words. And again, I'm sure you can all think of examples where, you've asked a question about how someone's feeling. No, I'm totally okay with it, honestly. But visibly are really not okay with it. So again, why are people, using that sort of the barrier and corrupting the language to not really say what they mean? The overuse element there that we're talking about. So this is where, and this probably applies to all of us, and myself not accepted, is, so take some examples of overused emotional words and then feeling words. Take the example of love. I love ice cream. I love my new car. Chocolate. My new smartphone. But if we're overusing that word, so what word do we use for our partners and our children? So it's where words are overused and then lose their validity or their currency. So similarly, the opposite end of the spectrum, hate. You know, I hate motorways. I hate Brussels sprouts. I hate bankers. You know, if we're saying that at that extreme, you know, going back to Ruth's spectrum of words before, you know, that's at the extreme end of the spectrum. You know, what words are then left for feelings about things like racism, child abuse, for example? So again, it's getting people to realise where they're overusing words that then mean when they use them when they're really needed, they've lost their efficacy. The exaggeration one, so this is more where people are essentially lying in order to get attention. So often people in teams who feel like or the perception that they're being ignored will do this to over-dramatise or get noticed. It often can lead to them being alienated. So, you know, think of the story, you know, the boy cried wolf. So, you know, none of these examples that I'll give you are true in a literal sense. So someone who will say, I feel like I've been hit by a train. I feel crushed. I feel ripped apart by that feedback. You know, literally those things haven't happened, but, you know, it's sort of then corrupting that language, so it's trying to mask what they actually mean. And then the final one, reduction then, or sort of minimization, is where people are trying to reduce the impact of the feeling, especially if they think it's socially unacceptable in the place where they operate. So again, you've asked the question and someone will say, you know, no, I'm fine, you know, don't worry, I'll be okay, it's not a problem really, you know, there's nothing wrong. Actually, internally, their experience of that emotion and feeling is way beyond that, but they think it's socially unacceptable in that scenario, to be honest. So they'll reduce the words that they're using around that emotion and feeling. So then people aren't getting the right communication about what their emotional needs are, and therefore can't support them as well. So it's about trying to encourage that fear-free environment where people are able to use that terminology.
Thanks, Neil. And I think moving on from that, building on it, we then need to look at indirect communication. So I'm sure I feel like may well be familiar to you. Maybe you use it yourself, maybe you hear other people use it. But what we find is that people will substitute, they'll pop in the word I feel like, a label, a thought, a behaviour. So to give you some examples, I feel, looking at the labelling that I mentioned earlier on, I feel like a fool, I feel like an idiot, I feel like a child, I feel like a disaster. So actually they're not, by putting the word like in and attaching a label to it, they're not effectively communicating their feeling. And we find that people do that a lot because it almost distances themselves from the feeling. They might also make that communication indirect by attaching it to a thought. So, for example, I feel like you were out of control, or I feel like you shouldn't have done that, or I feel like he's going about it all the wrong way. So actually that's more of a thought than a feeling. And by adding I feel like and then attaching it to a thought, it confuses things, it makes it indirect, it isn't then clear, well, what actually is the feeling that you are experiencing. And then similarly, you can attach a behaviour to something. So this can often be quite graphic, it can be quite entertaining, but it usually does have a masking or a distortion kind of effect, a distorting effect. So, for example, I feel like shooting her, I feel like strangling him, I feel like smashing the whole thing. It's quite extreme, and it's certainly not a feeling. It's attaching that I feel like label to a behaviour. And all of those examples of indirect communication stop clarity. They stop allowing us to recognise actually what is the feeling that person has and what is their need or their unmet need. And I think that's a really crucial part of it in terms of working in any environment, whether that's at school, business, at home. Unless we're able to be really clear and clean about the way we're communicating those feelings, we're not going to communicate our need and we're not going to get those unmet needs met. So there's huge value then in naming emotions, and Neil, you're going to talk us through this.
Yeah, so I mean, so one of the things is this balance of psychological power and control, and this is in terms of, you know, when people are engaging with each other. So often, what you can often find that if there's an exchange between two people in a negative situation where you've got, you know, you can label one as the victim and one as the attacker. You know, if the victim can correctly identify what is happening at an emotional level and feeling level from themselves, the attacker loses some of that psychological advantage. And as well as, you know, as as a species, there is a fear of the unknown, which is often removed if we can name the feeling. So again, in those more toxic relationships, if we can train people to be able to notice, recognize, and then name and accurately label the feeling or the emotion, it gives the victims in those interactions much more power. So the ability to identify and name the feelings is a form of power and control, and obviously, like all power, it can be used for good and bad. But hopefully, in the situations we'd be using it, it would be to help people out of those toxic situations and interactions at a relational level. As I mentioned before, especially at sort of management and leadership level, if you're able to encourage that, one, for yourself being able to use that language more, to show that vulnerability and to share your own feelings and emotions and encourage that from others, you're more likely to be able to identify the unmet emotional needs of the people in the team around you. The expressing feelings versus predictions thing. So this is using that emotional language to. So I talked before about I hope we don't miss the target. Sorry, I hope we hit the target. So whereas if we can actually start talking about the feelings, is actually I'm really feeling really anxious about what happens if we don't hit the target. By naming it for yourself, it allows the other person to engage at a completely different level rather than just putting a hope out there. So that's a really important part of it. And the final bit, this is some really recent scientific research. There's a guy called Matthew Lieberman, and obviously, in neuroscience, the whole rise of the use of fMRI now and being able to sort of light up different parts of the brain and study what's actually going on. So the affect labeling, what that describes is the naming of the feelings and the emotions. And there's a couple of studies that he's done. So one was where they put people through a computer game which was used to stimulate social rejection. And by looking at the parts of the brain that lit up during that process, what they realized was that the area of the brain that deals with social rejection is exactly the same part of the brain that deals with physical pain. So essentially, by being able to name those feelings and emotions, it reduces the physical sensation of that. And they took that research a bit further. So what they then did was to look at, through that facial recognition that we talked about earlier, getting people to look at different emotions. And again, they noticed that part of the area that brain that lit up was the amygdala, but by then naming, if they then got people to name accurately and more specifically the emotion they were seeing, it completely reduced the amount of activity in the amygdala. So basically what they're saying there is that by naming the emotions more specifically, we're reducing the intensity of that in the amygdala. And obviously we know that, if the amygdala isn't controlled, that's where the whole emotional and limbic part of the brain kicks in, and all the self-talk and mind chatter goes on that sort of stresses people out and makes people more anxious. So the science is definitely steering towards this idea that actually by naming these things, it has a specific physiological impact on how people experience those emotions as well.
Thanks, Neil. So we've just got a couple of minutes before we finish today, and just wanted to touch upon why we don't practice it more at work. And I think there are all manner of reasons, and we've touched upon a lot of these as we've been going through today. I think fundamentally people are often worried about being vulnerable in front of others. And it kind of goes back to that point we made at the start around consciousness and creating a space and a place which is psychologically safe for people to be willing to explore some of these things around emotions. And actually, the organisations that we work in, the cultures that exist, will have a huge impact. So some of the things that you can see on the screen here, people themselves may feel uncomfortable discussing emotions, but actually, does the culture help or not? Are they afraid of exposing themselves at a deeper level? Are they willing to be vulnerable? Sometimes people worry about the consequences of being too honest, or maybe fear that this is seen as a bit of a kind of soft, fluffy, touchy-feely type thing. Or perhaps it's going to be seen as a weakness. And from our point of view, actually, totally the opposite. It's a real strength to be able to communicate about emotions clearly and articulately. It has huge benefits and really helps to avoid some of the kind of problems that are associated with communication when it isn't done well. And so this final slide here is looking at the business benefits, really, of emotional literacy. Neil.
Yeah, so I mean, I think for us, it's it's often seen on one of the last bullets, and that's something it's not seen as tough enough for business to be focusing on this thing, and pink and fluffy and touchy feely. And I think there's so many negative connotations around that are perpetuated in lots of organisations. Again, because at senior level, often those people have never had to engage with this. But I think in our experience, where we can find senior leaders who see the value in it, and we can build it into programs and really get people to engage with this, the business benefits are significant. That people are more open and articulate and able to express what their needs are. You get more openness. People are able to deal with conflict and relationships in a much more open and honest way. People are much more able to talk about what they need, and so that clearer communication. There's enhanced productivity because there aren't miscommunications and people getting the wrong end of the stick. And that whole area of resilience, which we all know is a huge area now, with all of our employees being 24/7 permanently connected, digital lives. How can we help to make the workplace less fearful, less stressful, and reduce anxiety? And I think for us, where we've worked with companies who've really engaged with this, it's a massive driver behind changing those cultures. And it increases accountability for the individuals. So again, rather than sort of passing on, toxic situations for their managers to sort out, it gives people a language to be able to feel that they have that power to discuss with other people and feel in control of what's going on in a relationship. And ultimately, promotes that safe brain thinking that we've been talking about, where people can be more creative, more innovative, more relaxed, are able to sort of self-regulate. All of those things together are a big driver behind sort of productivity in the organisation and the time it gives back.
Thanks, Neil. I'm conscious that we are slightly over the hour, so we are recording this webinar, so if anyone does need to go, we'll make sure we send a recording through. But there is one question that's just come in that I think it would be worth mentioning. Question here about, we've talked about the importance of identifying emotions and being able to communicate them, but how important do you think it is to be able to control your emotions? And it's an interesting topic, actually, and one that we've done some recent work with another client around what we call emotional integrity. And actually, a lot of the emotional intelligence models suggest that being able to control emotions is really important, but actually thinking is now moving towards creating balance and being able to acknowledge the emotions, positive and negative, that we're experiencing, and integrate them, accept them, and recognize that they exist, and be able to kind of work with that balance and come back to center, rather than trying to control or suppress an emotion which actually is going to pop out somewhere else. So certainly my thinking is around that emotional integration and balance, rather than trying to control an emotion. So, and part of that is being able to identify it, which is all around this emotional literacy. If you can identify it, you can then identify what the unmet need is. You can be much more balanced and integrated in terms of how you respond to that. Neil, is there anything you wanted to add to that answer?
Yeah, I mean, I need a little bit to build on that. It's just around, it's about helping people to, as you said, be more specific about what the emotion is and noticing it, and then in that moment being able to then turn it into a cognitive process to say, so if I do use this, is this emotion useful in this situation, or is it not useful? So then it's not so much about suppressing it, it's about, as you just said, noticing it, recognizing it, and then making the decision, is this going to help me in this situation? So I think it's helping people to train themselves in that process, so that you're not suppressing emotions, which are, they're there for a reason. They're there to give us feedback as to what's going on internally.
Great, thanks, Neil. I think we've covered all of the other questions probably as we've been going through. So as we're slightly over, I just wanted to say thank you very much for joining us. This is an area that we're really experienced at kind of building into programs. So if you did want to talk in more detail about how that might work and any of the kind of lessons that we've learned in building it into leadership programs, really happy to have that conversation. So please do give us a call. But for now, I hope the rest of your Fridays go well. And we'll be sending through a recording of the webinar as well, so you'll be able to just kind of re-listen as well if you'd like to. So Neil, thank you, and we'll hope to see you, or not see you, to be joined by you guys again in one of our future webinars. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Bye.